Welcome back to The Price of Business. I'm your host, Kevin Price, talking to you about you and your business. Got my buddy on, Malcolm Out Loud. He hasn't been on for a while because, frankly, he's just too dang busy. But glad to have him on the program, as always. Going to talk about the fact that this last month in April was a horrific month in Iraq in terms of loss of life, with the U.S. No longer having any presence there. And you wanted to kind of do maybe a requiem of looking back on our war on terror in that particular place. It's been over a decade since we began that effort. And welcome to the program, Malcolm.
Kevin, how are you, buddy?
I'm great. I'm really good. Thanks.
Doing well. How's everything going? Good. Good.
Yeah. So your thoughts are, Iraq, of course, is still a disaster. Your thoughts on U.S. war on terror in Iraq?
Well, the same thing to me, Kevin, is what a waste. What an absolute waste. It's the same darn waste we're going to have as we now leave Afghanistan. I mean, what's going on in Iraq is just, and the way this particular administration, has handled it. All right, so this past April that we just closed, was after all of this waving the flag of victory and everything we've done out there and all the bloodshed and money. All right, so here's the story. Was the most deadliest month in Iraq. Over 700 people killed and almost 1,700 injured, again, due to these acts of violence and terrorism. And these are figures from the United Nations. This is, but let's look at the big scope of this, Kevin. When you take a look back at our 10 years of investment in this invasion of Iraq, which has always been a bit questioned. But the point is, here's my beef. If we're going to do something in this country, let's do it and do it well and bring it to completion. If that's anything we've learned since the days of Vietnam, we should darn well know when we put our foot in the pond, we better be ready to bring it to conclusion and do what's got to be done or stay the hell out. Mm-hmm. So now we're looking at, right now, almost 200,000 people killed in total area. And I'm talking now men and women in uniform, contractors, civilians. And how about a total cost, Kevin, of an excess of $2.2 trillion when you look at all the dollars here involved, which is a hell of a lot more than the U.S. Office of Management and Budget said, which would be about 50 to 60 billion, which is chump change to Washington, of course. So
right.
I would think Iraq has been a big failure. How's that?
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about that. If one looks at the history involved in that, we did have treaty obligations that if Iraq did not comply with certain things, the U.S. and the international community had an obligation to respond to that. It seems very evident as chemical weapons are being used in Syria, there's a very high likelihood those weapons of mass destruction came from Iraq because we saw an infrastructure for those type of weapons of mass destruction before we invaded. Now all of a sudden, where are the weapons of mass destruction? Hey, genius, they're in Syria. You don't have to look that far. Massive tunnels between Iraq and Syria where they could have easily been transported in the early days of the war or even before the war began. So we had what appeared as a treaty obligation to go in there. So when you look back at a situation, should we have not gotten ourselves in such treaties, or should we have gone for unconditional surrender and us put in our own government, kind of like we ended up doing essentially in Japan? What do you think when you look back? Because you know what? Even in this situation, they say hindsight's 20/20, but maybe not even in this situation.
I think there's been some very bad decision-making coming out of Washington, not just in this administration, but in the previous administration as well. The two hot buttons out there right now, and I studied the Middle East consistently. It's a big focus on our production. But I'll tell you right now, as you just said, is Syria, Kevin, and Iran. You talk about weapons of mass destruction. Saddam Hussein didn't have any. He was just a bad poker player. He was a bad poker player who got caught in a bad game, and he paid the ultimate price for it. Sadly, right now, there are a lot of people looking at this area now. When they hear the comment, as you just said, weapons of mass destruction, they kind of think right away of Iraq again. Well, it's not a pretend situation with Syria and with Iran. You have Syria, which has massive chemical weapons, which they have clearly been used on their own people. The death toll is in excess of 70,000 already that President Assad has, committed talk about crimes and atrocities. What he's done out there, folks, is created a genocide. There's no other way. We're looking at a live genocide right before our eyes happening with the Syrian people, sadly. And you're looking at a situation in Iran that is so volatile as their government continues to change over here that I think Syria is going to be the tipping point here. Once the rebels, who are not good people, by the way, Assad is just a matter of time before he comes down, Kevin. Okay?
Yeah, okay, but I got to tell you, I'm shocked that you have bit into the narrative that somehow Iraq didn't have weapons of mass destruction. We know what they did to the Kurds. They killed thousands of Kurds with chemical weapons. We saw infrastructure. We had photos of infrastructure where the Secretary of State showed those photos at the UN of infrastructure that would create chemical weapons in Iraq. And, we got smoking guns. We got the factories where they would be made. And then, all of a sudden there's this narrative that the left has promoted and that the media has promoted. They never had them. Yeah, they had them, but they moved them to Syria. Why isn't that more plausible that the weapons moved from Iraq to Syria than Iraq never having had the weapons at all? That's what I don't understand.
Well, I don't have the answer for you in regards to that.
But you said you don't believe Iraq had the weapons of mass destruction. So that's the part that I'm troubled with. You don't believe that he was a, quote, bad poker player. I agree he was a bad poker player, but he also had chemical weapons and weapons of mass destruction. He used them on the Kurds. It was well documented.
Well, but the weapons of mass destruction that were being referred to back then were nuclear type weapons. They weren't chemical weapons.
No, they weren't. They never were. I never heard a single testimony in an international forum where they said that Iraq had nuclear weapons. It was always chemical weapons. They never came to that conclusion.
Yeah.
So, you've it's like you've been in entirely into the left's narrative on what's happening internationally and what's happened with Iraq. Do I think we've mishandled Iraq? I have. But to try to revise and rewrite the history that there wasn't a violation of international law, that the U.S. wasn't obligated from international law to intervene, to ignore all that and to buy into the left narrative, I find it shocking, Malcolm.
The bottom line at this point is that Iraq is part of our history at this point. The focus needs to be on Syria and Iran. That's where the problem is. Iraq is ancient history, and whatever happened to that talking point about the weapons or what have you, or biting into any narrative, I really don't give a darn, okay? The point is that the problem is right now with Syria is going to be a tipping point in this area. You're going to see some real problems in the next 12 to 14 months, my friend, that are going to go way beyond anything you ever thought with Iraq when it comes to what's going to happen with Syria and Iran. It's very serious business.
I will say it's important. It is important.
Absolutely not. I do not think we should have intervened with Saddam Hussein. Do I think it's been a good trade-off, the loss of life?
Oh, no. So I gave you two perspectives. I gave you two perspectives that were alternatives.
That's Malcolm's narrative. Let's be real clear on that, my friend.
Yeah, I gave you two other alternatives of what we could have done. I would have done things differently as well. But we did have treaty obligations to go in there, and if we ignore that, we're ignoring a narrative that was real in our international history. And I find it very frustrating when people completely ignore what actually happened that got us there. And so that's what I find frustrating. And if we don't recognize what happened, we'll end up doing it again and again and again. I don't see any good options, for example, in Syria.
The problem at this point, Kevin, is we have bailed completely on Iraq. Like everything else we've done, it's been a shoddy job.
Oh, yeah.
We've left the job unfinished when we got involved to begin with. We've now invested all kinds of money there, American taxpayers' money, totally wasted because Iraq is going to hell in a handbag real quickly. Yep. The strategy there was never a good strategy to begin with. Our government has really screwed that area up. But having said that, remember one thing when we're talking about this, I have no narrative of the left or the right. I have my narrative. Let's be real clear on that point. You have me on your show. You know that I don't take a talking point from the left nor the right because I think they're both corrupt. How's that?
Yeah, there you go. Very good. That is, but I hate to say it, what you're using as a talking point of the left. To ignore the history itself is shocking to me, and you're too smart to do that. And that's the part that bothers me. You saw what happened with the Kurds. You saw the infrastructure. And to pretend it never happened is I mean, it's just mind-boggling to me, and that's the part that bothers me so much. And you're right, there's so much corruption on both sides. The Republicans have become nothing short of a circus in the way they conduct themselves. So, and in Syria, the Syria situation is unbelievable. Both of our options there are horrific. You obviously can't support the current regime, but what's going to replace them is going to be as bad or worse than the current regime.
Here's the problem. Here's the deal that you're missing. Saddam Hussein was a bad guy, no question about it. There are a lot of bad characters out there in this part of the world, no doubt about it. Now, what's happening is, though, with this hurrah, hurrah attitude of let's go in and handle anybody who has a weapon or a problem, what's developing here is this vacuum. The leadership that is out there, whether it be Mubarak, whether it be Hussein, whether it be Assad, what's happening is, the real story here is the people that are replacing these governments is absolutely the spread of
incredible
of the Muslim establishment. That is the real story here.
Absolutely. You went from countries that at least were corrupt and warm and not warm, but at least civil to the West in Israel, and they're being replaced by horrific regimes that are committing genocide whenever they get popped up. Just look at the Coptic Christians in Egypt, and and that are outwardly hostile towards Israel. I agree. This so-called Arab Spring is an international nightmare. It's an international winter that's being backed up by the U.S. government. You and I agree entirely on that. I appreciate the lively conversation. What I love about you is you and I can disagree and still be friends in the end. I think you're a great guy. I love what you do, and we're going to have you back on to talk more about the disaster that we are creating in Syria. It is horrific what we're doing there. Thanks so much. Malcolm Out Loud, you need to check him out. I check him out all the time. I check him out at malcolmoutloud.tv. I check his videos. Insightful, very, very great commentary. Thanks for being with us.